The story begins in what looked like a quiet, picture-perfect suburban neighborhood. On the surface, this community seemed like an ideal place to live. The streets were lined with well-kept houses, manicured lawns, and children playing safely outside. Families moved here because they believed it offered peace, safety, and stability. Behind this image of perfection, however, there was something else at play, a powerful and overbearing homeowners association, better known as the HOA. Like many neighborhoods governed by HOAs, this one had strict rules and regulations meant to protect property values. Residents were expected to follow guidelines on everything from the color of their houses to the length of their grass. Some saw these rules as a benefit, ensuring the area stayed attractive. Others saw them as unnecessary restrictions that turned neighbors into watchdogs. At the center of it all was the HOA president, a woman who prided herself on being in control. From the very beginning, the HOA president was known for her strict, almost obsessive enforcement of rules. She didn't just ensure compliance, she enjoyed catching others breaking the smallest regulations. Something as minor as leaving a trash bin out too long or planting flowers in the wrong color scheme could result in a warning letter. People whispered about her behind closed doors, calling her the sheriff or, less kindly, the queen of fines. For most homeowners, it was easier to comply than to challenge her authority. Into this neighborhood came our main homeowner, the person who built the fence that sparked the entire conflict. Unlike others, this homeowner valued independence and believed in personal property rights. He didn't buy his house to be controlled by an HOA president. For him, the house represented freedom, a place where he could create a home for his family and live peacefully. He paid his dues, respected community spaces, and didn't bother anyone. In short, he was a good neighbor. But this wasn't enough for the HOA president. From the moment she noticed him improving his property, her eyes were fixed on him. She saw his independence as a challenge to her power. The HOA had always been able to intimidate others into compliance, but this homeowner wasn't like the rest. He didn't bow to threats or give in to pressure. In her eyes, that made him dangerous. The irony was that the community itself didn't need micromanaging. Most families took pride in their homes, and there was very little disorder to begin with. Yet the HOA president insisted on inserting herself into everyone's private life. Over time, the atmosphere of the neighborhood shifted. Where there should have been warmth and community spirit, there was quiet tension. The fence issue. The heart of this story begins with something as simple and ordinary as a fence. For most people, building a fence is a straightforward decision. You want privacy, you want to keep pets or children safe, or you simply want to mark the boundary of your own property. That was exactly the case here. The homeowner decided to build a modest, tasteful fence around his yard, not to provoke anyone, not to break rules, but to make his home more comfortable. The fence was not oversized, nor was it flashy or ugly. In fact, it blended nicely with the overall style of the neighborhood. Built from clean, sturdy wood panels, it matched the house and improved the appearance of the property. To make sure he did things properly, the homeowner even checked city requirements and zoning laws. He filed for the necessary permits, got them approved, and made sure the fence did not cross into any public property. By all legal standards, it was completely compliant. For the homeowner, this was a small improvement with big benefits. It gave his family privacy from passing cars and protection for their children while playing in the yard. It also added value to the home, something any reasonable neighbor would have respected. But in this particular neighborhood, there was one person who saw it differently, the HOA president. From the moment she noticed the wooden posts being placed, she grew restless. To her, the sight of that fence wasn't just another home improvement, it was a challenge to her authority. She believed every major change in the neighborhood had to go through her approval. Even though the homeowner had followed city laws, she insisted the HOA rules came first. Almost immediately, she confronted him. With arms crossed and a stern tone, she accused him of breaking HOA guidelines. According to her, the fence was out of harmony with the community. She claimed it blocked sight lines, ruined the uniform appearance of the street, and violated the HOA's aesthetic standards. Her words weren't just complaints, they carried threats. She warned him that if he didn't stop construction, she would issue fines and possibly take legal action. The homeowner, calm but firm, reminded her that he had city approval. He explained that the fence sat entirely within his property line and that no laws were being broken. To him, the HOA president's objections were baseless and personal. But instead of backing down, she grew more determined. Within days, official letters began arriving in his mailbox. Each one from the HOA, demanding immediate removal of the fence. The tone of the letters grew harsher, filled with legal jargon and threats of escalating fines. What was supposed to be a simple home project now felt like the beginning of a war. HOA president's obsession. What started as a simple disagreement over a fence soon revealed the true nature of the HOA president. For her, this wasn't just about one homeowner putting up wooden panels, it became personal. She began treating the fence as if it were a direct threat to her authority, and her behavior grew increasingly obsessive. Every day, she found a new reason to criticize it. If the height seemed too tall from one angle, she complained. If the color of the wood looked too dark under the sun, she complained again. She claimed it clashed with the community aesthetic, even though several other homes already had fences of their own. But unlike those neighbors, this particular homeowner was someone she wanted to make an example of. Her obsession didn't stop at verbal warnings. She started driving by the house multiple times a day, slowing down to take pictures of the fence, jotting down notes, and even stepping onto the edge of his property to inspect it. Neighbors noticed her unusual behavior and whispered about how far she was taking things. Instead of focusing on genuine issues, like repairing sidewalks or maintaining shared spaces, she dedicated all her energy to proving that this fence didn't belong. The homeowner tried to stay calm. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he also wasn't about to be bullied into tearing down something that was legal and properly permitted. To him, the HOA president's fixation was less about rules and more about control. He began keeping his own records, saving every threatening letter, photographing her when she trespassed, and documenting the approval he had from the city. But the more he stood his ground, the more determined she became. It wasn't enough for her to win, she wanted to crush his resistance entirely. She started spreading rumors around the neighborhood, telling others that the fence was illegal, unsafe, and harmful to property values. She even hinted that the homeowner was a troublemaker who didn't respect community rules. Instead of rallying support, however, her tactics began to backfire. Many neighbors quietly sided with the homeowner. They were tired of her power trips, tired of the constant nitpicking, and tired of living in fear of fines. While they didn't always speak up, they were watching closely, waiting for the moment when someone would finally stand up to her. What the HOA president didn't realize was that her obsession was leading her into dangerous territory. The harder she pushed, the more likely it became that her own actions, and her own property, would come under scrutiny. Unreasonable demands. The fence was barely complete when the homeowner began receiving an endless stream of demands from the HOA. At first, it was just a warning letter, a stern notice that the fence violated community standards and needed to be removed within 10 days. But when the homeowner ignored this baseless order, the situation escalated quickly. The HOA president unleashed a flood of unreasonable demands. One letter claimed the fence was too tall and blocked the visual uniformity of the neighborhood. Another insisted the color of the wood clashed with the surrounding homes, even though many neighbors had fences painted in different shades. A third demanded that the homeowner not only remove the fence but also restore the lawn to its original appearance within a week, at his own expense. The demands were not just ridiculous, they were impossible. No one could reasonably comply with them, especially since the fence was already legal under city law. But that was the point. The HOA president wanted to overwhelm the homeowner into submission. She knew most people would fold under the stress of mounting fines, legal threats, and constant harassment. Soon, fines began appearing on the homeowner's account. First, it was $50 per day for non-compliance. Then it grew to $100, and eventually, she threatened to raise it to $250 daily until the fence was gone. Along with the fines came threats of a lawsuit, warnings that the HOA would place a lien on his property, and even claims that they could foreclose on his home if he didn't comply. For the homeowner, it was a surreal experience. He had followed the law, obtained the right permits, and stayed within his property lines. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal for improving his own yard. His attempts to reason with the HOA were met with cold, robotic replies, always signed by the president herself. It was clear she wasn't interested in compromise, she wanted total victory. To make matters worse, she began showing up in person, knocking on his door at odd hours, demanding immediate removal of the fence. Sometimes she brought other board members with her, trying to intimidate him with numbers. Other times, she came alone, armed with a clipboard full of violations. Each encounter was more hostile than the last, as though the simple presence of that fence was driving her to the edge. But while she believed she was tightening the noose, the reality was very different. Every outrageous demand, every fine, and every threatening visit only made her look more unreasonable. Neighbors began to talk openly about her abuse of power, and the homeowner started preparing a defense that would expose her hypocrisy in front of the city. What the HOA president thought was her strongest weapon, her authority, was about to become her downfall. Homeowners research. While the HOA president grew louder with her threats and fines, the homeowner quietly shifted strategies. Instead of arguing back emotionally, he decided to fight with facts. He knew his fence was legal, but he also knew that in a battle with the HOA, proof mattered more than words. That's when he began digging deep into research. The first step was gathering every piece of paperwork related to his fence. He pulled out the building permit he had obtained from the city, the approval stamps from zoning officials, and the detailed diagrams showing where the fence sat on his property line. Each document confirmed what he already knew: the fence was 100% legal and within his rights as a homeowner. But he didn't stop there. He began reviewing the HOA's own bylaws. Late into the night, he pored over pages of rules and regulations, looking for anything that supported the president's claims. To his surprise, nothing in the bylaws specifically prohibited fences like his. In fact, there were vague statements about maintaining community harmony, but no exact height limits, no required colors, and no wording that gave the HOA power to override city permits. The deeper he looked, the clearer it became that the HOA president wasn't enforcing rules, she was inventing them. She was using her position to intimidate homeowners into compliance, hoping they wouldn't know their rights. That might have worked on others, but not on him. Next, he researched property deeds and land surveys. By comparing his deed with county records, he confirmed again that the fence sat perfectly inside his boundaries. He even hired a surveyor to double-check, just to eliminate any possible doubt. The results came back crystal clear: the fence violated nothing. As his file of evidence grew thicker, he began documenting the HOA president's behavior as well. He saved every threatening letter, every fine notice, and even printed screenshots of emails she had sent. He logged the times she trespassed on his property to take pictures and made notes about her unannounced visits. Piece by piece, he was building a rock-solid defense. But he wasn't just thinking about defense, he was also preparing for offense. Through his research, he discovered something powerful: the city's authority overrode the HOA's in legal matters. That meant if the city declared the fence legal, the HOA had no standing to demand its removal. This was the turning point. Armed with knowledge, permits, and undeniable proof, the homeowner was no longer just a target of the HOA's harassment. He was ready to flip the situation on its head. What the president thought would be an easy victory was about to become the start of her greatest mistake. Escalation of conflict. Despite the homeowner's calm and well-documented stance, the HOA president refused to back down. In fact, the more evidence he gathered, the more aggressive she became. What should have been a minor disagreement about a fence now turned into a full-scale neighborhood conflict. The HOA began increasing the pressure. Fine notices arrived almost daily, each one with a higher amount than the last. What started as a $50 penalty quickly ballooned into hundreds of dollars. Threatening language filled every letter, warning that failure to comply could lead to liens against his property, lawsuits, and even foreclosure. The president was determined to make his life miserable until he gave in. But the homeowner didn't flinch. He calmly filed away each notice, adding it to the growing folder of evidence. The more the HOA pushed, the stronger his case became. Still, the pressure wasn't easy. Every trip to the mailbox felt like opening a new attack. Neighbors started whispering about the situation, and the tension in the community grew heavier by the day. The president's obsession also became more visible. She drove past his house constantly, sometimes stopping in front of the fence to glare or take pictures. She knocked on his door at odd hours, demanding immediate action. At one point, she even brought a landscaper to the property, claiming they had authorization to tear down the fence if he refused. The homeowner stood firm, warning them that any attempt to touch his property without legal authority would result in police involvement. This bold resistance enraged her. She began rallying other HOA board members, trying to paint him as a reckless homeowner who refused to follow rules. She spread rumors that his fence was dangerous, devalued neighboring homes, and violated long-standing traditions. While some neighbors avoided getting involved, others began quietly supporting the homeowner. They too had suffered under the HOA's heavy hand and admired his courage to fight back. The conflict reached its peak when the HOA president sent an official notice claiming that the association would take him to court if he didn't remove the fence within 7 days. To her, this was the ultimate power move. But what she didn't realize was that her threats had triggered a chain reaction she could no longer control. The homeowner had already reached out to the city, inviting officials to inspect the fence and review the permits. What he expected was a simple confirmation that his fence was legal. What no one expected was that the inspection would uncover something much bigger, something about the HOA president's own house that would turn the entire situation upside down. The battle had escalated, but the real war was only just beginning. Community reactions. As the conflict over the fence grew louder, the rest of the neighborhood could no longer ignore it. At first, most residents watched from a distance, assuming it was just another one of the HOA president's petty disputes. After all, she was infamous for nitpicking. But this time felt different. The homeowner wasn't backing down, and the fight was playing out in plain sight for everyone to see. Neighbors began to whisper among themselves. At backyard barbecues, in passing conversations, and even on community social media groups, the fence became the hottest topic. Some sided with the HOA president, believing that strict enforcement kept property values high. They argued that if one person broke the rules, others would follow, and soon the neighborhood would spiral into chaos. These were the homeowners who feared the president's wrath more than they cared about fairness. But a larger group quietly admired the homeowner. Many of them had been victims of the president's heavy-handed tactics in the past. Some had been fined for leaving their trash bins out too long, while others had been reprimanded for something as small as planting the wrong flowers or parking slightly off-center in their driveway. They remembered how helpless they had felt when she came after them. Now, watching someone stand up to her felt refreshing, almost inspiring. The more the HOA escalated, the more sympathy the homeowner gained. Neighbors noticed that his fence wasn't ugly or disruptive. In fact, it blended nicely with the community. The HOA's aggressive response seemed excessive and personal, not fair or balanced. Quietly, residents began offering words of encouragement. Some slipped notes of support into his mailbox. Others stopped by to say they were rooting for him. A few even confided their own stories of harassment by the HOA president. Meanwhile, the HOA president noticed the shift. She could feel the neighborhood's eyes on her, but instead of reconsidering her approach, she doubled down. She believed that if she lost this battle, she would lose her authority forever. To her, this wasn't about a fence anymore, it was about maintaining control. The community atmosphere became divided. Board meetings grew tense, with whispers, side glances, and subtle defiance directed at the president. Some residents stopped attending altogether, while others started questioning the HOA's decisions more openly. What once was a quiet, controlled neighborhood now buzzed with gossip and growing resistance. Unknowingly, the HOA president had created the very problem she feared most, a community rallying against her authority. And while she was busy trying to destroy one homeowner's fence, she was also tearing down the trust and respect that held her power together. The stage was set. The community was watching closely, waiting to see how far this battle would go. And no one was prepared for the shocking twist that was about to surface. Homeowners' evidence. By this stage, the HOA president believed she had the upper hand. With each threatening letter and fine, she was certain the homeowner would eventually cave. But what she didn't realize was that he had been quietly preparing a case stronger than she could ever imagine. While she was busy obsessing over his fence, he was building an arsenal of undeniable evidence. The homeowner started with the basics, his city-approved permits. He had copies of every application he submitted, stamped and signed by officials, proving his fence was legal from the very beginning. Alongside the permits, he had detailed diagrams showing the exact placement of the fence relative to his property line. These maps confirmed that not a single inch of the fence crossed into common areas or neighboring land. Next, he gathered county records and property deeds. With the help of a surveyor, he obtained a fresh property survey that left no doubt. The fence was entirely within his legal boundaries. This survey became a key piece of evidence, one that directly undermined every claim the HOA president had made about encroachment or violations. But the homeowner didn't stop there. He knew that facts alone weren't enough, he needed to expose the HOA's behavior as well. So, he kept meticulous records of every interaction. Each threatening letter was neatly filed in chronological order. He saved all emails, highlighting the aggressive and sometimes unprofessional tone used by the president. He even logged the dates and times she trespassed on his property, complete with photographs of her standing near or inside his yard while snapping pictures of the fence. One of his smartest moves was recording conversations. On multiple occasions, he captured her issuing verbal threats, warning him that if he didn't comply, she would make his life miserable. These recordings not only revealed her hostile attitude but also showed how far she was willing to go beyond her actual authority. With every document, every photo, and every recording, his case grew stronger. He wasn't just defending a fence anymore, he was exposing a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. His evidence painted a clear picture: the HOA president was acting out of personal vendetta, not genuine concern for the community. The homeowner carefully organized all of this into a binder, sectioned and labeled for easy reference. By the time he was done, he had enough proof to not only defend himself but also embarrass the HOA in front of the entire neighborhood, and even city officials. What the HOA president thought would be a simple battle over a fence was now turning into a legal nightmare for her. And soon, the evidence the homeowner collected would trigger an inspection that would expose her biggest secret of all. City inspection. Armed with a mountain of evidence, the homeowner decided it was time to bring in outside authority. If the HOA president believed she could override him, he would prove her wrong by involving the one power she couldn't intimidate, the city. With a calm confidence, he filed a formal request for a city inspection, asking officials to review his fence and verify its compliance with zoning laws and building codes. When the city inspector arrived, the scene drew attention from curious neighbors. Everyone knew this wasn't just about a fence anymore, it was about power. The HOA president showed up too, clipboard in hand, eager to argue her case. She strutted around as if she were in charge, pointing to the fence and declaring it illegal and damaging to property values. But the inspector wasn't interested in her personal opinions, he wanted facts. The homeowner presented his paperwork. Permits stamped by city officials, property surveys, and photographs showing the fence's construction process. The inspector carefully measured the height, checked the materials, and compared everything to city regulations. His conclusion was clear: the fence was entirely legal. It met every requirement for safety, zoning, and property boundaries. This alone should have ended the matter. The HOA president had no authority to demand its removal once the city confirmed its legality. But instead of accepting defeat, she grew red with anger. She accused the inspector of overlooking details and insisted he take a closer look, not at the fence, but at the entire property line. Her arrogance was about to cost her dearly. As the inspector widened his review, something unusual caught his eye, not on the homeowner's property, but on the HOA president's. Just across the street, her house stood proudly on a large lot, but the inspector noticed irregularities in its placement. Curious, he pulled up the original city plans and compared them with current conditions. The discovery was shocking. Part of the HOA president's own house extended beyond her legal property line and encroached on public land. Neighbors watching the inspection began to murmur. What was meant to be a routine review of a fence had suddenly flipped the spotlight onto the HOA president herself. The inspector made notes, took photographs, and informed her that a formal investigation would be launched. The very same woman who had been demanding the demolition of a legal fence was now facing the possibility of having her own house altered, or even partially torn down. The homeowner stood quietly, a small smile forming. He didn't need to gloat, the facts spoke for themselves. By trying to destroy him, the HOA president had exposed her own biggest weakness. The city's involvement had changed everything, and the balance of power was shifting fast. HOA president's rage. The city inspector's findings should have ended the dispute. The fence was declared legal, and the homeowner's evidence stood unshaken. But instead of backing down gracefully, the HOA president's anger exploded. For someone who had ruled the neighborhood with fear and intimidation, the idea of being exposed was unbearable. From the moment the inspector left, her behavior became even more extreme. She stormed around the neighborhood, venting to anyone who would listen. She claimed the inspector was incompetent, that the homeowner had manipulated the system, and that the whole process was unfair. In her mind, she wasn't just losing a fight over a fence, she was losing control of the entire community. Her rage grew into reckless actions. She began sending even more letters, this time filled with wild accusations, that the fence was unsafe, that it lowered property values, and even that it attracted criminal activity to the neighborhood. These claims were so absurd that many residents rolled their eyes, but she didn't care. She was determined to push her narrative, no matter how unbelievable it sounded. The homeowner, meanwhile, stayed calm. He knew losing his temper would only play into her hands. Instead, he continued documenting everything, her angry rants at meetings, the false claims in her letters, and the way she twisted facts to suit her story. The more evidence he gathered, the clearer it became that she was digging her own grave. Her rage also started to isolate her from the community she once controlled. Neighbors who had once feared her began openly questioning her decisions. Some refused to pay fines she issued. Others skipped HOA meetings altogether. The whispers grew louder, people were tired of her tantrums and heavy-handed tactics. But her biggest mistake came when she tried to interfere with the city's ongoing investigation. Desperate to protect herself, she called officials repeatedly, demanding that they ignore the encroachment on her property. She accused them of bias, threatened to sue, and even attempted to block inspectors from stepping onto her land. These actions didn't intimidate city authorities, instead, they raised red flags. The more she resisted, the more determined officials became to dig deeper into her violations. The irony was brutal. She had set out to destroy a simple fence but ended up putting her own house under the microscope. Her rage blinded her to reality. The more she fought, the worse her situation became. For the homeowner, it was almost poetic justice. He didn't have to shout, argue, or lose his cool. All he had to do was let her anger burn itself out, because every time she lashed out, she revealed more of her own corruption. Evidence of corruption surfaces. While the HOA president was busy raging and making wild accusations, a surprising turn of events shifted the entire battle. One of the frustrated neighbors, who had long felt mistreated by the president's unfair fines and bullying tactics, quietly approached the homeowner with valuable information. He handed over a thick folder filled with records, letters, and notes he had kept for years. Inside was evidence that the HOA president had not only abused her power but had also been misusing community funds. The documents revealed suspicious transactions, questionable maintenance fees, and instances where money collected for community improvements had mysteriously disappeared. It painted a picture far worse than just a personal grudge against a fence. This was a pattern of corruption. The homeowner couldn't believe what he was reading. There were copies of checks made out to cash, invoices that didn't match any real repairs, and even receipts from luxury stores that had nothing to do with HOA expenses. The president had been running the HOA like her personal bank account, all while scolding others for violating rules. Word spread quickly among neighbors once the evidence came to light. People who had once been silent out of fear now stepped forward with their own stories. One neighbor revealed how she was fined for having a flower pot slightly outside the approved zone, but when she checked records, she realized her fine money had never been officially logged. Another shared that he was forced to pay for a community project that was never completed, because the funds had vanished. As more voices joined in, the community began to see the bigger picture. The fence dispute wasn't just about property lines, it had become the spark that exposed years of shady dealings. The HOA president had targeted the homeowner because he refused to bow down to her authority, but in the process, she had opened the door to her own downfall. The homeowner, realizing the weight of what he held, made copies of the documents and handed them over to both the city officials and an attorney. Now the issue wasn't just a neighborhood feud, it had escalated into potential legal trouble for the president. Embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of power were serious accusations, and the evidence was too strong to ignore. The community that once feared her now stood united against her. What had started as one man defending his fence had transformed into a full-scale rebellion against corruption. The tide had turned completely, and the HOA president's carefully built facade of authority was crumbling faster than she could control. For the homeowner, it was a bittersweet victory. He hadn't just saved his fence, he had uncovered the truth that no one else dared to expose. Community rallies against HOA. The moment evidence of corruption surfaced, the neighborhood's atmosphere completely changed. For years, the HOA president had ruled with intimidation, issuing fines for trivial reasons and silencing anyone who questioned her. But now, her grip on the community was slipping. People who once avoided confrontation suddenly found their voices. It started with a few neighbors gathering informally on porches and driveways, whispering about the documents that had come to light. Soon, those whispers turned into open conversations. Residents began sharing their own stories, fines that had no record, fees that disappeared, projects that never got completed. Each story added another layer to the growing outrage. Within days, a formal community meeting was organized, not by the HOA, but by the homeowners themselves. The turnout was larger than anyone expected. Families who had never attended an HOA meeting before showed up, eager to finally be heard. The homeowner who had been pressured to remove his fence was asked to speak first, and when he shared the evidence of corruption, the room erupted in anger. People demanded answers. Where did our money go? Why were we punished while she enjoyed luxuries? How long has this been happening? The president, who had once thrived on controlling these meetings, was now cornered. Her usual tactics of shouting down opposition no longer worked. The community wasn't afraid anymore. What truly united the residents was a shared sense of betrayal. They had trusted the HOA to manage funds fairly, to keep the neighborhood maintained, and to enforce rules evenly. Instead, they discovered they had been financing the president's personal lifestyle while she bullied them into silence. The rallying cry became clear: the president had to go. Neighbors signed petitions to remove her from her position. Committees formed overnight to demand transparency in finances. Even those who had once been neutral stepped forward, realizing that silence would only enable more corruption. Interestingly, this collective movement brought neighbors closer than ever before. People who barely knew each other began working side by side to protect their community. Bonds were formed over shared frustration and the determination to take back control of their neighborhood. The homeowner who started it all by refusing to take down his fence was seen as a hero, but he reminded everyone that this wasn't about one person, it was about fairness for all. His calm persistence had lit the spark, but the strength of the movement came from unity. By the end of the rally, it was clear that the HOA president no longer held power. The people had spoken, and for the first time in years, the community was united not in fear, but in hope. Legal action begins. After the community rallied together and exposed the HOA president's corruption, the situation escalated beyond neighborhood meetings. With undeniable evidence of financial mismanagement, fraud, and abuse of power, legal action was the next logical step. What started as a personal fence dispute had now turned into a full-scale legal battle. The homeowner who had been targeted initially took the lead. With the support of neighbors, he contacted an attorney who specialized in HOA cases. Together, they compiled the evidence: fraudulent financial records, missing funds, and testimony from multiple residents. Every letter, fine notice, and suspicious transaction was carefully documented and organized. The case was no longer about one person's fence, it was about years of misconduct that had harmed an entire community. City officials also joined in. The inspector who had previously reviewed the fence had already noted the HOA president's unusual behavior during the investigation. Now, with proof of corruption surfacing, the city saw a responsibility to intervene. Reports were forwarded to higher authorities, and soon, investigators began looking into the HOA's finances. The HOA president, once confident and untouchable, suddenly found herself drowning in legal threats. She hired her own lawyer and tried to dismiss the accusations as lies and misunderstandings. But the evidence was too strong. Every time her attorney tried to deflect, the homeowner's side produced another document or witness statement that contradicted her story. Meanwhile, the community remained united. Neighbors who had been fined unfairly were eager to testify. Residents who had lost money in fake improvement projects brought their receipts. Some even discovered that their signatures had been forged on HOA forms. The sheer number of complaints made it impossible for the president to claim innocence. As the legal process began, the homeowners' one small battle became headline-worthy within the town. Local newspapers covered the story, portraying it as a tale of ordinary citizens standing up against corruption. The public support only strengthened the community's resolve. The legal action also gave the residents a chance to regain control of their neighborhood. Petitions were filed to restructure the HOA board, demand audits of all past financial activities, and establish stricter oversight. The goal was not just to punish the president, but to ensure that no one could ever abuse the HOA system again. For the homeowner, the legal fight was exhausting but empowering. He realized that standing his ground had created a ripple effect, his refusal to back down had inspired his neighbors to take action, and together they had brought justice closer to reality. The HOA president's downfall was no longer a question of if, but when. HOA president's retaliation backfires. As the legal case against her grew stronger, the HOA president became more desperate. Instead of stepping back and allowing the process to unfold, she doubled down. Her pride wouldn't allow her to admit defeat, so she launched a new wave of retaliation against the homeowner and the community. But this time, her actions only accelerated her downfall. Her first move was to target the homeowner directly. She issued him fresh fines, accusing him of everything from improper lawn care to blocking community views with his fence. These fines were laughably exaggerated, and many neighbors immediately recognized them as baseless. But she hoped to overwhelm him, thinking that constant harassment would break his resolve. Instead, he carefully filed each new fine as further evidence of harassment and abuse of authority. Next, she tried to divide the community. She spread rumors that the homeowner was only fighting her for personal gain, that he wanted to take over the HOA himself, and that he had manipulated neighbors with false promises. But the residents, having seen the financial records and lies firsthand, weren't fooled. If anything, her smear campaign only made her look more desperate and untrustworthy. Her boldest act of retaliation came when she attempted to interfere with the legal process itself. She sent angry letters to city officials, claiming that the investigation was biased. She even tried to intimidate witnesses by warning them that testifying against her would bring serious consequences. These reckless moves crossed a line. Not only did they fail to stop the case, but they also opened the door to additional charges, this time for obstruction and intimidation. Every attempt she made to regain control ended up backfiring. The fines she issued became proof of abuse. The rumors she spread turned neighbors further against her. The intimidation tactics alerted authorities that she was willing to manipulate and threaten people to protect herself. Each misstep only strengthened the homeowner's case and weakened her credibility. By now, the once feared HOA president had become a cautionary tale. Residents who once trembled at her authority now laughed at her frantic efforts. Meetings that she once dominated with an iron grip turned into open forums where neighbors spoke freely about her misconduct. Her power had slipped through her fingers, and no amount of retaliation could bring it back. For the homeowner, watching her backfire after backfire was strangely satisfying. He didn't need to retaliate, her own actions were doing the job for him. What began as her attempt to punish him for building a fence had spiraled into a chain of mistakes that would ultimately destroy her position completely. In trying to destroy him, she had only destroyed herself. City orders investigation into HOA funds. The mounting evidence of corruption and the HOA president's increasingly erratic behavior forced the city to take official action. What had started as a small neighborhood dispute now escalated into a full-scale government investigation. The city ordered a formal audit of the HOA's finances, a move that sent shockwaves through the entire community. For years, residents had quietly wondered why their monthly dues never seemed to translate into real improvements. Streets were cracked, landscaping was poorly maintained, and promised projects were endlessly delayed. Yet, year after year, the HOA claimed funds were tight. Now, with the city stepping in, those suspicions were finally being addressed. Auditors arrived armed with spreadsheets, bank records, and a determination to uncover the truth. They demanded access to every financial report, every transaction, and every receipt. The HOA president, once so commanding, looked visibly nervous as boxes of documents were hauled out of her office. Her confident facade was crumbling under the weight of accountability. As the investigation unfolded, shocking details came to light. Thousands of dollars in maintenance fees had no receipts. Payments were made to companies that didn't exist. Personal expenses, like spa treatments, luxury handbags, and even vacations, were traced back to HOA accounts. The paper trail was undeniable. The president had been using community funds as her private wallet. Residents were furious. They crowded city hall meetings, demanding answers and calling for justice. Neighbors who had struggled to pay rising HOA fees now realized they had been financing her lavish lifestyle. What angered them most was the betrayal, not just the money, but the years of being bullied, fined, and intimidated while their dues were being stolen. The city's involvement gave the community a new sense of hope. Officials assured residents that if fraud was proven, the president could face both civil and criminal charges. The audit also raised the possibility of restitution, meaning the stolen money could potentially be recovered and returned to the community. Meanwhile, the homeowner who had started this battle by defending his fence watched the process unfold with quiet determination. His small act of resistance had triggered a chain reaction that reached City Hall. What was once a fight over a fence had become the exposure of years of corruption. For the HOA president, the investigation was a nightmare she couldn't escape. Every check, every invoice, and every unexplained expense painted a clearer picture of her misconduct. The harder she tried to explain, the more tangled her lies became. The city's order was the final confirmation that this wasn't just a neighborhood quarrel anymore. It was a case of fraud, and the walls were closing in. The shocking verdict. After months of heated disputes, piles of evidence, and countless testimonies, the day of the verdict finally arrived. What had begun as a simple fence dispute had spiraled into a courtroom drama that gripped not only the neighborhood but the entire town. Residents packed the courtroom, eager to see justice delivered. The air was heavy with anticipation, and all eyes were fixed on the judge. The HOA president, once so powerful and commanding, now sat hunched at the defendant's table, her confidence shattered. Her lawyers had tried every trick in the book, claiming the evidence was circumstantial, accusing the homeowner of staging a vendetta, and even arguing that the missing funds were just clerical errors. But none of it held up. The evidence was overwhelming: bank statements, fraudulent invoices, personal expenses charged to community funds, and testimony from dozens of neighbors. When the judge began to read the verdict, the room fell silent. One by one, the charges were listed: misuse of funds, fraud, harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. The findings were damning. The judge declared the HOA president guilty on multiple counts. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom as the weight of the decision sank in. But the real shock came with the punishment. Not only was she ordered to step down immediately as HOA president, but she was also fined heavily and ordered to repay the community for the money she had stolen. In addition, she faced probation and the very real possibility of further criminal charges depending on the results of ongoing investigations. Her once iron grip on the neighborhood was shattered in a single moment. The homeowner, sitting quietly among his neighbors, felt a wave of relief wash over him. He hadn't set out to become a hero, he had simply refused to be bullied into tearing down his fence. Yet his persistence had exposed years of corruption and brought justice not just for himself but for the entire community. As the judge's gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, the residents erupted in applause. Some cheered, others hugged, and a few even shed tears of relief. For years they had lived under the shadow of fear and intimidation, but now, the truth had prevailed. The shocking verdict wasn't just about punishing one corrupt leader, it was about restoring balance and fairness. The community finally had a chance to rebuild, free from the grip of a tyrant who had abused her power for far too long. For the HOA president, it was a humiliating fall from grace. For the homeowner and his neighbors, it was a long-awaited victory, and proof that even the smallest act of defiance could spark monumental change. Community celebrates victory. When the judge announced the guilty verdict against the HOA president, it felt like a heavy curtain of fear had finally been lifted. For years, the community had lived under her intimidation, dreading every new fine, letter, or confrontation. Now, with her power stripped away, the residents could finally breathe freely. What followed was not just relief, it was celebration. That very evening, neighbors gathered together in a way they hadn't in years. Instead of tense HOA meetings filled with threats and arguments, this gathering was full of laughter, food, and shared stories. Families brought homemade dishes, children played freely in the yards, and for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of true unity. The fence that had started the entire conflict stood proudly as a symbol of resistance and victory. The homeowner who had refused to take down his fence was hailed as the spark that lit the fire of change. People came up to thank him personally, some even apologizing for not standing up sooner. He reminded them that the victory didn't belong to him alone, it belonged to the entire neighborhood that had finally united and found its voice. His message was clear: when people stand together, no bully can control them. The celebration wasn't just about joy, it was also about reclaiming trust. Residents began planning how to rebuild their HOA with fairness, transparency, and accountability. Committees were formed, volunteers stepped forward, and neighbors who once barely knew each other now felt connected by a shared victory. Instead of fearing the HOA, they were determined to transform it into something that truly served the community. Even local media joined in the coverage. Headlines spoke of ordinary homeowners defeating corruption, turning a small-town story into an inspiring example for others. People from nearby neighborhoods visited, curious to see how one community had managed to topple a corrupt HOA leader and emerge stronger. For the children, it was a night they would never forget. Running around while the adults celebrated, they saw their parents smiling, hopeful, and free from worry. For the older residents, it was a reminder that justice, though sometimes slow, eventually arrives. The homeowner, standing quietly amid the celebration, looked at his fence one more time. What was once just a barrier for privacy had become the symbol of their strength and unity. The very thing the HOA president tried to destroy had ended up becoming the cornerstone of a new chapter for the community. It wasn't just the end of a battle, it was the beginning of a better future. HOA president's home demolished. The downfall of the HOA president had already been dramatic, but the most shocking twist came months later. During the city's investigation into her financial misconduct, inspectors also uncovered something far more ironic: her own house was in violation of multiple zoning and construction codes. For years, she had built additions without permits, extended her property lines into public land, and ignored safety regulations she demanded everyone else follow. While she fined residents for minor issues like a misplaced flower pot or a slightly high fence, she had been living in a home that was itself illegal. The city wasted no time in addressing the violations. She was ordered to bring her property into compliance or face serious consequences. At first, she tried to stall, claiming she was being targeted unfairly. She filed appeals, hired lawyers, and even attempted to sway officials with her old intimidation tactics. But just like before, her power had vanished. The evidence was too clear, and her reputation was already ruined. When the deadlines passed and no corrections were made, the city delivered its final order: her home would be condemned and demolished. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Residents who had once trembled under her authority were stunned, then overjoyed. The woman who had demanded a neighbor tear down a perfectly legal fence was now watching her entire house being scheduled for destruction. The demolition day felt surreal. Neighbors gathered at a distance as city crews arrived with heavy machinery. Some watched quietly, while others couldn't help but smile at the irony. For years, she had enforced rules selectively, punishing others while breaking them herself. Now, the ultimate hypocrisy was being corrected in the most dramatic way possible. As the machines tore into the walls of her home, dust rising into the air, it felt like the final chapter of her reign of power was closing. The once feared president stood by helplessly, unable to stop the inevitable. The fence she had tried to destroy still stood strong, while her own home crumbled to rubble. For the community, it was more than just justice, it was poetic. The same laws she had twisted against others had now been enforced against her, and this time she couldn't escape. The homeowner who started it all watched silently, not with glee, but with a sense of closure. He didn't need revenge, the truth had played out on its own. Her arrogance had led to her downfall, and now, quite literally, the house of cards she had built was gone. The demolition marked the end of her rule, and the beginning of a fairer future for everyone else. Symbolic justice. The sight of the HOA president's home being demolished was more than just a legal consequence, it was symbolic justice. For years, she had stood as the face of unchecked power, wielding her position to intimidate neighbors and bend the rules for her own gain. Watching her house crumble to the ground wasn't simply about punishment, it felt like the universe had restored balance. Residents who gathered to witness the demolition described it as a moment of poetic irony. The woman who had demanded the removal of a perfectly legal fence was now stripped of her own home because it violated the very laws she once used to torment others. It wasn't just about bricks and walls, it was about hypocrisy meeting its end. The homeowner who had refused to take down his fence saw it as a full-circle moment. His small act of defiance had spiraled into a chain reaction that revealed lies, corruption, and abuse of power. And now, the physical destruction of her home stood as a public reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the rules. The fence still stood tall, unshaken and strong, while the house of corruption had fallen. Neighbors couldn't help but interpret the demolition as a cleansing of sorts. The community that had lived under her shadow was finally free, and the land where her house once stood became a blank canvas. Some joked about turning the lot into a community garden, others suggested a playground, spaces where laughter and life could replace years of bitterness and fear. The symbolism ran even deeper. Her downfall showed that intimidation and greed can only last so long before truth and unity overpower them. It wasn't the loudest or most aggressive that won, it was persistence, patience, and collective strength. The fence had started as a simple structure for privacy, but it became a symbol of resilience, fairness, and justice. Even beyond the neighborhood, the story resonated. Local newspapers framed it as a tale of irony and justice served, and nearby communities took inspiration. Homeowners who had long felt powerless against corrupt HOA leaders now felt encouraged to stand up, to question, and to demand accountability. For the residents, justice wasn't just in the verdicts or fines, it was in the symbolism. The homeowner's fence represented fairness and strength, while the president's demolished house represented arrogance and downfall. Together, these images told a powerful story that no one would forget. In the end, the community realized they had gained something more valuable than victory, they had reclaimed their dignity. Justice had not only been served but delivered in the most fitting and symbolic way possible. Final resolution. With the HOA president gone, her house demolished, and the corruption exposed, the neighborhood finally entered a period of peace. What began as a fight over a simple fence had transformed into a story of justice, unity, and resilience. But now came the most important part, the final resolution, rebuilding the community in a fair and transparent way. The first step was reforming the HOA itself. For years, it had been a tool of intimidation, but now the residents wanted it to serve its true purpose, protecting and improving the neighborhood. At a special meeting, the community voted to dissolve the old board and elect new leaders. This time, the board wasn't filled with people seeking power, it was made up of volunteers who wanted accountability, fairness, and open communication. One of the first changes they introduced was financial transparency. Monthly reports were made public, with every dollar accounted for. No more mysterious maintenance fees or projects that never happened. Residents could see exactly where their contributions went, and for the first time in years, they trusted the system. The fence homeowner, though hailed as a hero, humbly declined any leadership position. He believed the victory belonged to everyone and encouraged neighbors to share responsibility equally. His only request was simple, that the HOA never again be used to bully or control, but to protect the values of fairness and respect. His words resonated deeply, setting the tone for a new chapter. As the weeks passed, the neighborhood slowly healed. Relationships that had been strained by fear and mistrust grew stronger. Neighbors held block parties, organized cleanups, and even began working together on long-delayed projects, like fixing sidewalks, planting trees, and creating community spaces. The unity forged through struggle now blossomed into cooperation. For the residents, the most powerful reminder of their journey stood right in front of them, the fence. It was no longer just wood and posts, it was a monument to standing firm against injustice. Children played near it, neighbors admired it, and every time they looked at it, they remembered how it sparked the courage to challenge corruption. The final resolution wasn't just about punishing one corrupt leader, it was about ensuring such abuse could never happen again. The HOA was rebuilt on trust, the community was closer than ever, and justice had been served in the most complete way possible. For the homeowner, the satisfaction was simple. He hadn't wanted a fight, he had only wanted to protect what was his. Yet in doing so, he helped his neighbors reclaim their dignity and freedom. The fence still stood strong, and so did the community behind it. The story had come full circle, from conflict to corruption, from downfall to renewal. And in the end, the neighborhood was stronger, fairer, and finally at peace.